Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers, particularly Naira, for inviting us to speak on our research on data-driven decisions in agriculture. So the talk today will be given by three of us, myself and Professor Peko Hozoi and our student Bernardo. So just to frame the presentation, next, I want to give you a perspective of next slide. Yeah, sorry. I want to give you a general perspective on the research program that we have at MIT. And essentially what we're looking into is a sort of an economic development project for farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. So the problem is that most farmers in Africa are poor, despite the fact that they actually own an enormous asset, namely the land that they have. The production or their yield in general is below standard, and they do not upgrade the methods that they have. They actually even probably produce the same types of crops most of the time. And a big part of it has to do with the fact that they do not have the capital to upgrade their production. It's a complicated situation because there are many creditors out there that would be willing to give money, but they're concerned about whether or not the farmers will actually be creditworthy and take the money and actually upgrade their production. Simultaneously, farmers are very scared about taking debt and mortgage their land because if things don't go well, they may lose actually their only asset to survive. And that limitation has hindered the amount of credit flowing between banks and farmers. And even actually, if you look at some of the data, it appears that 80% of the times when banks loaned money to farmers, farmers didn't do what they were supposed to do and actually just took the money and disappeared. So the risk in the credit market there is quite real. Without capital, farmers are not able to buy new technologies like irrigation systems or measurement devices and so forth. They're not able to use more sophisticated fertilizers. As a result, or even buy new and better seeds, understand the market in order to produce what's actually has higher market value as opposed to producing everything that they've done before. So the technology companies are not benefiting from this situation either, and we arrive to a locked economy. And what we're trying to understand is there a way in which we can collect the correct set of data, do the correct set of experiments, and enable this economy once again? So what is the idea behind it? Well, basically, if we actually collect data from the farmers, particularly ones that are sort of progressive and have allowed themselves to use new methods, new fertilizers, new seeds, and so forth, take this data and extrapolate the value for farmers that have not used these particular technologies, we can actually calculate the upside of this intervention. And with understanding the upside, bankers as well as technology companies can come in to share the risk for this production. So in other words, they will contribute either money or equipment or fertilizers with a percentage of the upside of the profit that the farmers can have. So with this extrapolation, we have a confidence level that these different communities, of course, can participate in an attempt to unlock this sort of locked economy. Still, we have to understand how we have to equip the bankers with understanding of who is credit worthy, which means that we have to use data from the ground. And we also have to enable sort of a better understanding of what technology and where would be the most effective. All of this points to one aspect of the project that we won't talk about today, which is sort of a data platform that is shared by all the stakeholders in this particular economy. It's a complicated data platform because the valuable data is competitive. When a group of farmers or some farmers employ sophisticated technologies, new seeds, produce new products, and make quite a bit in the market, they are more reluctant to share their data with other competitors. And so actually they tend to hide that particular data. So the only way they will share their data if they feel they're compensated correctly for this, which means that there has to be a place where data is traded in a market that evaluates the upside of the data that they contribute. Similar situation occurs with markets for eliciting information about farmers from either local communities, mayors, politicians, what have you, that will then provide the information about the partners to assess their creditworthiness. Next slide. So you can see from this description that, while we aim at sort of developing the future of the farmer, there are quite a few limitations for doing this. The first one is what I just mentioned, which is the data sharing question, whether it's actually developing the right infrastructure in terms of a market, which is a dynamic market that evaluates the data and compensates people, as well as convincing people to participate in this particular market. So what is the incentive for a farmer to participate if the farmer can increase the competition against what they're doing? Well, it has to be that the data is viewed as an investment in other farms, which means that they are compensated appropriately, and they potentially could actually make quite a bit of money just by selling the data of their experimentation. We need practical data. We need aspects of experimental data, and so that's important. So, we know that quite a few companies are willing to actually put in the resources to invest in experimentation, so that's really important. We have to also change a mindset, which is really hard, of a farmer that is used to develop enough to survive and has not viewed themselves as people that have an incredible asset that they can utilize. The last component is the one about credit assessment, which we won't talk about, but it's a very important piece in sub-Saharan, in particular, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, as the political situations are very heterogeneous. The ownership of land is very different. The role of mayors and leaders of different towns play a very important role. And then at the end of kind of trying to go for reliable information about the farmer and their ability to pay off a credit becomes a critical question to answer. Next slide. And just a quick couple of examples about the sort of the employment of technology to understand that the variance in production here. So this is an example of cereal, and you're looking at dark blue as high production and very light as low production. And it's very interesting to see the huge disparity in the way cereal is produced. And if you make an observation, you notice that the kilogram per hectare production in countries like the United States, Europe, South Africa, certain parts of India, and so forth, are much higher than the rest of the countries, suggesting that this is not just a question of soil or temperatures, but rather employment of technologies of different kind and the sophistication of the production. Next slide. So one can say, well, what about, if you look locally at different, at one country, would you see this variability? And we have here an example from Ghana and different regions of Ghana, where you see a similar type of variability this is based on simulation models, but nevertheless could potentially be verified in some real data. So FP stands for farmer's practice. So you see in the common practice, this is the blue bar that you get. But if you enhance that through precision agriculture, you get the orange bar. And then if you add to that sophisticated irrigation, you get the gray bar. And you can see that the employment of technology clearly has a steep effect in almost all the areas within Ghana. So it's not a question of local versus global. It really is a question of how much sophistication and technology can be employed. So part of this talk today is to tell you about the techniques for extrapolation in terms of understanding the effects of the employment of these technologies. And at this point, I will hand it over to Peko to give you a little bit more perspective on how these problems are looked at from a data-driven perspective. Peko.
Great, thanks, Manzur. So I'm going to start by showing one more piece of data. So Manzur showed you that there's a lot of heterogeneity across the world if you look globally versus locally. I'm now going to zoom in on one local example to see how much gain you really can get when you start to deploy these technologies. So this is U.S. corn yield trends as different technologies are introduced, including new varieties of seeds. And the y-axis here is the grain yield. And you can see that once the impacts of the technology start to take off, you can actually get almost an order of magnitude increase in production, which again goes back to sort of re-emphasize the point that Munzer was making, that there are gains to be had if you can invest in the capital or if you can invest in the technology to get things moving. So I'm going to now take a couple of slides to give you sort of the general framework of how we're going to address the problem, and then hand off to Bernardo, who's going to work through some detailed examples. Great, thanks, Bernardo. Next slide. Okay, so the heart of the analysis lies with the individual farms. So imagine that you have an individual farm, and these farms have certain characteristics, and the characteristics of the farm includes things like the weather, the light levels, the soil, things that are sort of inherent characteristics of these different localized farming increments, farming units. Okay, so this farm, next, Bernardo, you go through a season, you get some kind of a yield, and after that, you can sell the crops, you make some amount of money. So if we know how much yield comes out of this farm, we can make some estimates of what are the payoffs of planting different kinds of crops. In order to decide whether or not technologies are worth investing in, you also have to be able to estimate what is the increase in yield given different kinds of interventions. And an intervention might be something like irrigation, or it might be something like fertilizer, but there are things that we can do that change the outcome. So ultimately, if we're going to do some kind of a model and we want to optimize this, or we want to understand how much investment is worth putting into this, I need to have some kind of a model or some kind of a box. So next, Bernardo, that takes these interventions plus these characteristics and estimates a yield. There. So I need some sort of a function here, which is a yield, which is going to be a function of irrigation, fertilizer, farm characteristics. And this model, typically, if you do this from scratch, is going to be incredibly complicated because it depends on the physics, it depends on chemistry, it depends on biology. And so there are a number of different ways that this can be done. One is that there are different kinds of models that are freely available. One of them that we've been looking at is WFOS, which is the World Food Studies, which is a terrific simulation. It's a mechanistic model that again takes as an input things like seed type, weather. So you pull weather data, you pull light data, you pull soil data, and it's broken down into many different components where you actually look at the physics and the chemistry to predict what are the yields going to be. So those are models that are available. They are somewhat reliable. We've looked at measuring how reliable they are. They're pretty good, but obviously it's a very complicated system. So it's hard to be super predictive in these kinds of situations. The second option is, if you don't have a mechanistic model, is to learn from the data. So if I have data from many different farms in Africa or many different farms in the US, can I use those to predict what comes out if I try different interventions? So one way to think about that is to think about sort of a matrix where I have a bunch of different farms. So these are farms that are going to be classified based on their characteristics that we've listed up above. So light, temperature, soil type, et cetera. And then on the x-axis the x coordinate of my matrix, these are different interventions, irrigation, fertilizer. And so for different types of farms and different interventions, I can measure what happens in the different farms that we have examples of, and then try to predict what will come out of different farms. So if I take a different farm to a different intervention, how does that change my yield? So again, there's no mechanism in this here. This is now just purely learning from the data. But the third thing that one could do, which is the direction that we'd like to go in, is to mix the two. So now suppose I have, if I look at the sort of my pink matrix here, imagine the pink data is data that comes from running something like WOFOS or one of these other simulations. I can run it on certain combinations of farms and interventions. I can measure what WOFOS predicts from those. And then I can use that to fill in the rest of the squares. So you can learn the rest of the squares, but which is pretty good, but it's again still limited by the limitations of WOFOS. So ideally what you would like to do is combine the best of both worlds, which is the one that's in the middle here. So I take the data that I have, which may be limited, maybe heterogeneous, maybe incomplete, but I take whatever data I have from real farms, fill those in the matrix. Then I ask, okay, where are the holes in this matrix where I can get the most benefit from additional information? You run something like WOFOS to fill in those squares. And now I can do some kind of a matrix completion to predict what happens in the squares that I have no information about. And this is what Bernardo is going to tell you about in the next few slides. He's going to show you some examples, both using WOFOS data and real data to show how well we can do if we need to predict what happens when we employ different interventions on different farms. And I will now hand off to Bernardo.
Thank you, Professor. Let me start. Okay, so based on the description from Pekko and Munster, we can see that this data comes with a lot of challenges. In different countries, you have different data sets and you have different opportunities to collect available data. In the US, the main source is the USDA. And even with a very large census, there is a scarcity for different kinds of details in the data that do not really allow us to know what exact farming practices are being employed in different counties or by different farmers. This situation also happens in many other countries. So based on these challenges, one of the first things that we decided we wanted to tackle was how can you know what is the effect of an enhanced farmer's practice if you do not know or if you do not have data on what the farmers are doing, but rather you have data on their yield. So with this in mind, the work we have done is based on the following. Suppose you see a map of different plots, and in each of the plots you will see their yield. Now, as Pekko said, the yield depends heavily on on the farm's inherent characteristics, such as soil, temperature, and weather. So for example, suppose on this plot, you see each plot, and then the number above is the yield they are having at a current season in any number of units. So if you see something like this, then we can say, well, some farms are doing differently than others. However, we can attribute this difference to, for example, weather. Suppose that the farms on the left had a more dry climate, and the farms on the right had sun, but also had enough rain to improve the yield. So in this case, if we ask ourselves, is someone doing an enhanced farmer's practice? It seems either everyone is doing it or no one is doing it, because the inherent characteristics can explain all the variability we are seeing. Now, suppose the map we are seeing is this one, where you can have, for example, this farm that is producing a very large yield, surrounded by farms that are not producing that large yield. So in this case, even if you take into account the weather, it seems that something is missing, because these two farms had almost the same weather, yet had a very different yield. So if you see a map like this, then you say, well, then what is probably happening is some of the farms are actually enhancing their practices, and that is yielding a better production. Now, with this in mind, we set to devise a method that says, or that uses two different snapshots of data, each snapshot with a different rate of technology adoption. So suppose you see first a snapshot like the first one I showed, where the weather and where the weather and inherent farm characteristics are explaining all the variability. And then you see another snapshot where you actually have a large rate of technology adoption, around 50%. And then the variability within different neighborhoods of farms is not explained anymore by the inherent farm characteristics. this methodology has a strong assumption, which is geographical homogeneity in technology adoption. So you are saying in different neighborhoods, there is a similar rate in technology adoption. If we want to try this method in US data, for example, where the details on practices are not collected annually, so it is an useful case scenario for our methodology. Then, for example, so here we are seeing the hay productivity in the US in tons per acre in different states of the US in the 1940s, or in 1940 and in 1965. And and the plots I'm showing are analogous to the clipart plots I showed before. And we can see how in the 1940s there is a very strong geographical correlation in the yield productivity across counties in the US states. So we can see how if we take a county with a very low productivity, the counties around it also have a low productivity, and the same case with a high productivity. Now, if you go to 1965, then you still see a heavy reliance on geographical correlation. So farms that are together, they still share inherent characteristics, and they are still producing similar results. However, you do see a larger variability where some counties are doing more than their neighborhoods, or some counties are doing much less than their neighborhoods. And in this case, we are starting to see how the technology adoption that started that Dr. Peko showed in the US in the other slide is starting to show its effects, and it's starting to produce variability beyond the inherent farm characteristics. So if we do these results, it seems that the hay productivity has been increased by enhanced farmers practice by at least 0.5 tons per acres. And in corn, we see a similar effect in around 35 bushels per acre on corn, 35 bushels per acre. This methodology, we have also done some validation results. So for validation, we used an artificial data set using using historic yield from a drought year, which was 1988. So in that year, a large share of the US counties suffered a large loss in their production of corn because of a large drought that happened. And we did a data set where some counties were suffering this drought, and some counties were not suffering this drought. For that, we just used 1987 data. And without using the data on which county was assigned which treatment, we were able to build an estimation on the effect of the drought that was very close to the average loss that actually happened. We also did validation of our methodology with completely synthetic data, and we also saw similar positive results. And now, after this was one of the first challenges we decided to tackle, which is how are we going to estimate the effect of enhanced farming practices if we do not have the data? Then the other challenge that we have been talking about is, okay, now suppose you do have data on the interventions different farms are doing. How are we going to estimate on which farm what is the recommended intervention? For this, we are using matrix completion methods. As Peko described, a matrix completion method works like this. You have a matrix where for example, this matrix has the profit or the simulated profit of different policies, so irrigation and fertilization, on different soil types. And some cells are colored by the profit the combination is yielding. Some cells are black because we did not fill the entire matrix. And then what you do with matrix completion methods is you assume that the yield you will have for each soil type and each policy can be summarized as the linear product of two vectors. And that allows us to, even while having a sparse matrix, to fill out the rest, because you estimate the vector representing different soil types and different policies. So about irrigation and fertilization. This data is completely from WAFOS, but you can see how and we could compare how the estimation is correct. The matrix completion has different parameters we can tune. For example, one is the latent factors. So as I said, in matrix completion, what you are doing is saying each soil type can be represented by a vector, and each policy can be represented by another vector. And the estimated yield for a soil type, for certain policy on certain soil type, is just the product of this vector. Now, these vectors can be very long vectors or very short vectors. In the limit, they can be just a vector of one unit or a one-dimensional vector, where the product is just where the estimated yield is just the product of two scalars. The more dimensions this vector has, the more precise you can be. However, just as in other machine learning methodologies, if you put many dimensions in your estimation, you will incur in overfitting and your prediction will become bad. But here we have some examples of how the real yield, which is real according to WAFOS, and the predicted yield becomes more precise as we put more latent factors in different states. Now we want to know whether this methodology can work in the data sharing platform or the data sharing scheme we are envisioning to put the economy out of this gridlock. And for this, as you can imagine, the matrix completion is much better at the more data it has. So if you have a matrix where only 0.1% of the cells are filled, and you apply matrix completion, it will be worse than if you have 1% of the cells filled. So for that, we used real data from the USDA, where we said, okay, suppose different counties are different farms, and let's try to predict the yield a county will have on different crops. So if you have a matrix, each county is a row and different crops are columns. And let's see how well we do, and how many farmers we need to collect their data for, so that we can make good predictions for different crops. So we did this experiment where we said, okay, we will take all the real data from counties in the US, from their crop production, averaging over 5 years. And then let's suppose each county is a farmer, and let's have a couple of farmers start joining the platform, and let's see how you have a better and better correlation between the predicted yield and the actual yield within each crop production. And this is what we can see. So, for example, the crops where we have more data, such as soybeans and corn, you start with only 150 farmers. This has a mean correlation of 0. So if you have that little information, you are giving very bad predictions. But as you keep increasing the number of farmers in the platform, you can reach a correlation between predicted and actual yield up to 80%, which starts becoming good, much more usable for the farmers. And this also will connect us to one of the other challenges, which is, once you make this platform, how do you incentivize the joining of the platform? And as you can see, the first farmers who will join have very little incentive to join the platform, because the platform is giving recommendations that do not hold correlation to reality. However, their contribution to the platform is the largest. After you have many farmers, their marginal contribution will be very small. However, their incentive to join the platform will be very large. So we are also, as a group, working on ways to build an incentive scheme that will incentivize people to join the platform until it can have enough good predictions for all members.
Okay,
now we go back to Munzer.
Thank you, Bernardo and Pecco. So just to kind of wrap up a little bit, to say that matrix completion is a very powerful method for extracting kind of a model without having to parameterize the model a priori. So the idea is that you have this matrix of either farms and interventions or any sort of type of two-dimensional matrix, and you sort of recognize that while the matrix may be complex with a lot of interventions and a lot of farms, underlying it is maybe a low-dimensional matrix that generates it. You don't know a priori what the low-dimensional matrix is, and so you search for that. Then what Bernardo described earlier is really a trade-off between, finding a robust low dimension versus noise. And so the more you increase the dimension, you're basically interpolating the noise. And so it kind of gets into the same sort of question of bias versus variance that you get in the general learning algorithm. Part of the technologies that we're developing that we haven't talked about is what if, in fact, all this data is impacted by confounding factors that are not represented in the data, things that are affecting everything, maybe a drought that has happened or excessive rain in certain locations and so forth, something that is not represented in the data, or maybe even a weather phenomenon. To what extent then all of this information is biased and connected to this confounding factor? And can there be ways in which we can still see the causal relationship between the intervention to the outcome, despite confounding factors that may be affecting the outcome? So that's work and that we're developing, not just for this application, but a wide range of applications where interventions are an important piece. And finally, it's really important to understand how to set up this market that I talked about at the beginning, and the material that also Bernardo talked about in terms of creating an incentive to participate quantifies the value of your data. I think this is one of the most important questions that we face in general, is looking at a data set, how do you value that data set? Well, it has to be in the context of some sort of a prediction or some sort of learning or some aspect that you quantify. And what Bernardo showed, for example, is the trade-off between different players in the market and how potentially they could be adding a lot to the market but not benefiting enough, or maybe not benefiting but and the other extreme, so to speak, right? And so how do we systematically build a data sharing environment where people are all incentivized to participate or compensated for their participation? So this work that you heard today essentially brings together inference methods, causal inference questions, incentive mechanism design and incentive mechanisms to put together a viable solution to the farmers broadly, but although our focus is really the farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, and our collaboration is with OCP, which is the company that funds our research, that is very much interested in the fertilizer business and selling fertilizers to the company. So with that, I conclude the presentation. Thank you, Bernardo and Pecco, for your presentations. And Bernardo will be at that point online to answer any questions later on. Thanks a lot.